to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your latest financial update from across New Zealand and around the world. Coming up, Fonterra says globally traded milk will grow 35 billion litres or 70% by 2020, reducing our share of global trade from 40% to 30%. What do we need to do to box smarter? Trouble at mill. Make that AFCO's meat processing plants. Any end in sight to the industrial standoff? How soon will farmers feel the squeeze? And farm sales are up 72%, with prices up too. The latest findings. In our sector roundup, let's kick off with developments in dairy. Prices have dipped on the global stage, but are still at pretty good levels. What's the latest take on the state of dairy in the world markets? Joining me now is Ian Proudfoot, Agribusiness Partner for KPMG. Ian, great to see you.
Great to be here.
Now, the global dairy trade auction has just come in overnight, down again, down 4.5%. That's the lowest in 7 months. What do you make of that?
Well, I think part of the impact, as I see it, is an increased supply coming out of North America and Europe. You know, we're just getting into their production season now, and good prices have brought more farmers online. So I think there was always going to be a natural dip. I still have a strong belief that the price has moved to a new range, which is above where it's sat historically. But I think we'll always see volatility. I'm not surprised. Analysts
have been saying that it's been pretty stable so far, but are we going to have to revise that downwards now? I mean, there seems to be a clear trend.
You know, we've got a lot of production. You know, we've had one of the best seasons that we've ever had in this country. We've got good trends coming out of other markets. So there is more milk, and the challenge is who's going to buy it? You know, demand is definitely on an upward track, but is it tracking up far enough to soak up this demand? We may just see a short-term dip, but I think fundamentals are still very strong.
The high New Zealand dollar certainly hasn't helped.
Well, I think you've got to say the high New Zealand dollar has been linked to the prices that people have been paying for milk. So, you know, the two are definitely aligned. I think if prices do dip, we will see the dollar come down a little bit.
Now, Fonterra has revised its payout, of course. It's downwards as well. Farmers are going to lose out, 15 cents down to $6.35 a kilo. What's your take on that?
I think there's probably still some flexibility either way on that price. But my take is that, if anything, we might still see a small kick up on that price in the final. You know, Fonterra have a history of being slightly conservative in what they're forecasting and then delivering a little bit more. And I wouldn't be surprised to see something similar this year.
Fonterra CEO says by 2020, their own milk supply is expected to grow by 5 billion litres. That's up 25%. Is that doable in New Zealand?
It's going to take a real focus and a lot more engagement from Fonterra with the wider community, because, you know, to increase productivity and increase production by that level is going to mean a lot more intensity in our farming systems. It's going to put a lot of pressure on some of our our environmental issues, particularly in the South Island. So, you know, we can increase production. Farmers have really got to lift their game. They're going to have to do a lot to improve productivity behind the farm gate. And I think Fonterra is going to have to engage wider to sell the importance of dairy to the community.
Farm sales, they're up. First time in a long time, and prices are up as well. What does that say to you?
Well, they're at a peak since May 2009, which, you know, is, I suppose, when we were just starting to head into these issues that we've been having. I think it says that there's been a bit more credit around, so people have been able to borrow a bit more easily, and that's great. The banks have tried to free things up. I also think that it says maybe people are prepared to take a punt on another investment. And I think, you know, if people are starting to think about the business and make some new investments and potentially start growing again, we will see more consolidation of the family farms. The other thing, of course, is that maybe some people have been holding on for a couple more years than they wanted to before they could retire. And with a bit of an increase in pricing, they've seen an opportunity to tactically move their farm through the market.
Interesting. A quality kiwi fruit orchard in the Bay of Plenty sold for $170,000 per canopy hectare. That's pretty good. And that says to me there's maybe a new interest now in kiwi fruit orchards, well, despite all the trouble.
Well, I think G3 is a real positive. And, you know, if G3 works out as expected, there's a real chance that the kiwi fruit industry jigs itself out of that huge hole it's in at the moment, you know, reasonably quickly. So, you know, I was talking to people from the sector last week, and, you know, they're pretty upbeat and pretty positive compared to where they were 4 or 5 months ago. So, you know, I don't think the future's black for kiwi fruit. I think it's very much green and gold.
Now, it's worth $35 million in Northland. They're working hard right now, all of the growers, trying to keep the PSAV virus out of there as much as they can. Is that possible, do you think?
No. I think Hort 16A is a variety that we probably won't be growing in this country come the end of the next growing season. I think it will be substantially replaced with G3.
Ian, can we talk now about the meat sector and, of course, all the strike lockouts with AFCO and its workers affecting 8 plants around the country, up to 1,700 workers. Aren't they playing with fire? The industry is already deeply troubled.
I think you've got to look at an industry that can kill everything it needs to kill in over or less than half the time available. I think it's now about 43% capacity across the industry as a whole. Obviously, there's some peaks in there, so you can't run at that low level of capacity. But, you know, I would say if you're a worker in the meat sector, you really need to be aware that this is an industry of overcapacity. It is an industry where capacity does need to be taken out. You don't want to be giving the processing companies a reason to look at consolidating capacity where you're working.
What's really at the heart of this dispute from what you've been able to figure out? Is it just about who's going to be running the business? It's
about flexibility, I think, is the impression I get. And, you know, therefore, businesses are looking at how they get more flexibility. They are carrying more processing capacity than they need, and they do need to have business models that enable them to have that flexibility. The job for life scenario, the job where you get protected hours and protected benefits, that's pretty well a job of the past. You know, there's a desire to see much more flexibility in the workforce, and I think, you know, the meat sector is probably just starting to go down that track, and I can think we'll see a bit more issue in this sector as we go over the next year or two.
Meanwhile, interestingly, for Alliance Group, Asia is booming in terms of markets for them. They're going to be putting out way more beef over there. What's your reaction?
I think Asia is a big market opportunity for all our primary sectors, not just for Alliance Group. I think the important thing is that it comes down to how our companies are building relationships with Asian companies and creating market opportunities. So I think we're seeing, you know, Alliance have potentially created some great opportunities and have now been able to move some real premium product into the market.
Thanks, Ian. Coming up after the break, chasing China. According to the Chinese zodiac, it's the year of the water dragon, enabling the mighty Asian nation to see things from other points of view. Will that mean good news for New Zealand's trade minister visiting the world's second largest economy this week? Tim Grosser says he may confront his Chinese counterparts over the increasing use of penalty tariffs against our dairy trade. China expert Usha Haley is in the studio to update us on the emerging powerhouse. But first, 1 in 5 people on this planet is Chinese. That's 20% of the world's population. So answer this in our Farmers Facts and Figures quiz. What's the population of China today? Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, what's the population of China today? 1.3 billion people are Chinese out of a total global population of 6.7 billion. Joining me now is Usha Haley, professor of international business at Massey University and research associate at Washington, D.C.'s Economic Policy Institute. Her expertise, emerging markets. Let's talk China, and the Chinese Year of the Water Dragon is now upon us. What's that mean, Usha?
Well, it means change and more change. And as the Chinese say, we're living in interesting times. And I think the biggest change is in the area of trade.
Okay, we'll come to that. But there's also a lot of, in the political sphere, a lot of the countries in the world this year, surprisingly, are going to have a lot of leadership changes. About a third of the world's countries, 59 countries, according to you, will be conducting local, state, or national elections.
Yes.
What will that mean here in New Zealand for us?
Well, New Zealand is buffeted by other countries' larger economies, and so New Zealand has to be a little bit more agile for policy changes that could affect the economic environment in which New Zealand operates.
Now, the Chinese leadership is changing, and Ian, let me bring you in here. They're not exactly well known for democratic elections. We are talking about the Communist Party. What do you predict with leadership changes?
Well, I wouldn't predict a dramatic change in what's going to happen in China. As I see it, you know, they've set a 5-year strategy or 5-year plan in place last year, and I would expect that they will continue to follow through on that. The interesting thing is quite how they tweak the sort of mix between control and commercialism. And, you know, I think there's potentially some pressure in certain parts of the Chinese Communist Party in particular that maybe they've gone a little bit too commercial and maybe they need to pull back a little bit more on control. So we could see a bit tweaking in that sort of ratio. I think it would be gradual though.
Trade Minister Tim Grosser is there this week talking to a number of Chinese officials. What do you think his message is going to be?
I think his message should be that really what we need to do is have greater business interaction between China and New Zealand. We need to have more New Zealanders in China, learning about Chinese markets, talking to Chinese businesses and building their experience in that market. So hopefully Tim is going to be helping to create an environment where our business people can get the right connections and build those relationships more effectively. I think what we need to be looking for is a relationship with China that's much more two-way, where we're not just a source of technology and product, but we're actually a true partner in business ventures.
But wait a minute, we do have a free trade deal. Let me stop you there. And isn't that enough? We do have a free trade deal with China after all.
Well, I think you should look at the relative importance of New Zealand and the size of New Zealand vis-a-vis China. The United States is having trouble in trade with China, and so New Zealand has to evaluate its own position, its own bargaining position vis-a-vis that country. And Ian brought up a really good point about barriers that New Zealand companies face in China. A student of mine, a master's student at Massey, Helen Van Ash, has just completed her research report on the non-tariff barriers that New Zealand companies face when doing business with China. They're fairly extensive, ranging from culture to regulatory risk and other things.
Well, we can see, we've got a free trade agreement, but in terms of getting meat into the Chinese market, the Australians are far more effective at getting meat into the Chinese market than we are, but theirs goes significantly through the grey channel through Hong Kong. Our meat goes through the proper channels because we've got the free trade agreement. It just makes it harder actually going through the right way rather than through the grey way.
There you go. And so that's what I mean by non-tariff barriers. I mean, there's just many layers of China. There's the grey economy, there is the underground economy, and then of course there's the submerged economy that nobody really knows about or talks about.
So China is really still quite a mysterious force, even though we have many companies based there now doing business. And one of the areas that troubles our farmers, of course, are the tariffs on dairy exports. Tell me more.
Well, it's interesting. There's been some comment in the last little while. The Dairy Companies Association of New Zealand have just come out and questioned the penalty tariff arrangements that were put in place in the FTA. That was put in place, pre-2008, pre-Sanlu, and was a structure to sort of put tariffs on particular volumes. And we're now saying, well, the market's changed. There's absolute demand for our product in China. People want to buy a tin of baby food that's got the New Zealand inside, that's got that quality and safety that comes with New Zealand. So is it time to review that framework? And hopefully Tim Grosser will be able to raise that in his conversations this week.
Well, he is signaling that he may raise it with them, he may not. It's interesting, though, Usha, that when we signed the free trade deal in 2008,
yes,
the dairy exports, the taxes on dairy exports have actually now gone way above what was originally signed. Does this surprise you?
No, it doesn't. Because it's very difficult to predict what's going to be happening in China in the short or medium term. In the long term, we think that everything is going to come to equilibrium and markets are going to clear. But in the short and middle term, because it's so difficult to get information on China, it's so difficult to ascertain regulatory risk in China, companies have a difficult time adjusting to that economic environment.
Now, the U.S. and Europe are taking China to the World Trade Organization. They
Yes.
are very unhappy. There are 5 issues that they're mad as hell about. Tell me about that, Usha.
They're upset about Chinese imports into the U.S. and China not opening its markets as it agreed to do when it joined the WTO. And I've been involved in several industries that have engaging in this sort of trade, I'll say foul trade practices. Steel is one of them, auto parts, glass, paper, and now lastly solar. In all these industries, China has no real comparative advantage. That is, these are capital-intensive industries where labor is between 4 and 8% of the cost of production. In solar, for example, it's about 4%. But in these industries, China moved from being a net importer within the space of 1 or 2 years maximum to becoming the largest producer and one of the largest manufacturers, as well as one of the largest exporters in the world. So I wanted to see why.
How have they done it? That's the question.
Yeah. Well, we studied them, and how do you study China? Very, very carefully. And we studied China and found out that massive subsidies have contributed to China's transformation. But these subsidies are illegal under WTO regulations, and that's what I'm involved in.
How is a tiny country like New Zealand ever going to be able to get a fair deal when it comes to, let's say, solar panels? This is one of the areas being disputed now. Solar energy here in New Zealand could be extremely good news for us. But
yes.
how are we going to compete? How are we going to control it if the U.S. and Europe are struggling?
Yeah. I just gave a talk about that last week at Massey, a professorial lecture. It's a very good point. I think solar would be a natural for New Zealand, clean, green New Zealand. But what the Chinese do is, because of their scale of production, when they produce, they anoint a technology as dominant. And the Chinese have put their heft behind a mature technology. That's what they often do to reduce costs, because they don't really have a technological advantage either.
Let's talk a little bit about China and dairy exports, New Zealand dairy exports. You know, there's been a lot of criticism that Fonterra isn't really getting on board with China the way it should. That instead of just sending them our milk powder, for example, they should be producing more lucrative things like baby formula. What is holding Fonterra back from getting involved in China in that way?
I mean, the brands. And to me, one of the real challenges of building any sort of business in China is the fact that China isn't one market. China is 23 provinces, I think, with 31 provinces with a huge different number of very, very large cities. So if you're going to build a brand in China, it's not just a matter of running some TV ads, over a national network. There's a huge amount of effort that needs to be done to build brands city by city, and that's extremely expensive. So I think, from my perspective, what we need to be doing is building those partnerships with companies that potentially already own the brands and own that market space, in particular cities and regions in China, and then working to bring a value proposition to their product that means some of that value flows back to us. And I think I think Fonterra and a number of our companies are already working hard at that, but it's a very slow process.
It is. Fonterra's been in China now more than 20 years. How much longer can we wait?
Well, I think you've just got to take it city by city, area by area, product by product, and that's going to take a very long time. But the fact is, our recognition of the quality of what we're producing, the safety of what we're producing is continuously growing, and therefore that means that the consumers that can afford the high quality products are the ones that are looking at our opportunities. So, we will continue to make success and we will continue to make progress, but we've got to be smarter.
One of the Chinese businessmen, very successful businessman that we interviewed, said that it was a problem between the local crocodile and the foreign shark, and the local crocodile always wins out over the foreign shark. The Chinese businessmen that we interviewed for our book, The Chinese Tao of Business, all highly successful, including people such as Li Ka-shing and others, said that they have short-term profit horizons rather than long-term ones. That is, if they're not making profits within 1 or 2 years, they're out of the market.
Do you think more New Zealand businesses have to hear that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the reason is, what he said was, and he knows the Chinese government just about as well as anyone else, probably better than the Chinese government knows itself. He said that the reason for this is that you're so off base, the information is so bad, it's so corrupted, the information itself, that you don't know what you don't know.
Coming up after the break, future proof on the highways and byways of the economic world as our experts point out what's coming up. But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much global manufacturing does China produce? Come back quick. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much global manufacturing does China produce? China produces 1/5 of all global manufacturing. And now it's time for future proof and a little crystal ball gazing. Does China have to change the way it's doing business? For example, Usha, I know their labor costs are going up. Millions of people are leaving the countryside now, going into industrial cities. One-child family, there aren't a lot of young people there to take over as the older people age and die. China, too, is grappling and struggling, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. But the latest 12th five-year plan of the Chinese government highlighted 7 strategic industries that China is going to be focusing on. And it's a grab bag of high-tech and green tech. Labor-intensive industries aren't there. And this is a key indicator of where China is going to be putting its money. China doesn't see itself as a labor-intensive manufacturer.
So where will the manufacturing in the future be operating in the world?
Currently, China already is. It's the manufacturing floor of the world, the second largest manufacturer in the world, the largest exporter in the world, having overtaken Germany. But the problem, of course, is the flooding of markets with cheap Chinese products. And we can no longer, the book I'm working on for Oxford University Press and also the work I've done for the United States congressional interests and the White House, deal with the solar industry and the auto parts industry and others. The work that I've done shows that the comparative advantage in China is no longer labor. It hasn't been in a while. As you pointed out, Vietnam and India and others have lower labor costs. And the Chinese labor costs are now almost competitive, given U.S. productivity, with U.S. labor costs.
So that may very well be a game changer sooner rather than later.
It doesn't matter, because the industries in which China is dominating are no longer labor intensive. They are green technology, they're high technology, they're things like batteries, there are things like rare earths.
Yeah.
You know, the battle over rare earths that's
Right,
happening.
yeah.
And they're no longer textiles and things. That's gone. That's left the United States. It never was in New Zealand. And it's even leaving China now for Vietnam and others, Bangladesh perhaps.
Let's talk about some other international news at the moment. Ian, I know you're very keen on watching what's happening with the biggest Canadian grain handler, Viterra. It could be up on the chopping block, and that could affect us here in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, there's an expectation that Glencore, the global commodities trader, is going to make a bid for them today, somewhere in the region of about 6 billion Canadian dollars. The interesting thing is, having gone through the process with the BHP bid for potash of Saskatchewan last year,
which was turned down by the Canadian government. They didn't want foreigners coming in.
Glencore have seen the writing on the wall already and have partnered with Agrarium and another company, Richardson International, to take parts of the business. So the Canadian assets will stay predominantly Canadian owned. They'll obviously get some of the grain handling assets in the prairies. The interesting thing, though, is one of the assets Viterra own is their Australian and New Zealand grain businesses. So that will see Glencore potentially becoming a significant player in this market. And you know, that has a big potential to stir up our own arable sector and the arable sector in Australia.
And when you say stir up, good or bad?
I think, hard to say at the moment, but Glencore are, they're a world leader in this space, one of the very big players in the market. So, does that indicate a further internationalisation of our agricultural sector? What we're seeing with Glencore is, once they go into a sector, they generally continue to grow their footprint in that sector, and a fair chance we'll see that if they do this acquisition.
It's interesting that wheat production in Australia could fall as much as 13% in the coming season, and farmers over there are switching to barley and canola, for example. Do we know what we're doing here when it comes to grains of the world?
Our focus is very domestic when it comes to grains. We're predominantly, we still import a lot of grain, and that was one thing that I found quite surprising. So most of our bread is actually made from imported grain. So, I think the arable sector is going through a real process, and the Foundation for Arable Research is highly involved in that, of trying to really get a better take on what its market position is and where its opportunities are. When you look at it, potentially a lot of our opportunity seems to be in the area of seed production and that sort of thing. I think our arable sector has probably been going through a bit of a working out where its future lies at the moment, and actually getting the right products for our customers. If we're going to have a really successful aquaculture business in New Zealand, we need to produce our own aquaculture feed here. We can't be importing that, because that impacts the sustainability of the product. So potentially our arable sector needs to work better.
Okay, well, we'll keep a watching brief on what happens with Viterra. Interesting for people here. And also, what are you going to be watching now in the coming few days, Usha?
Well, I'm keeping my eye on the commerce decisions in the United States regarding solar. They just, I think this morning, decided on the steel rims, wheels from China. They levied tariffs against them, and that's going to be happening more and more. The EU is using some of my research for tariffs on China, as is Germany and the United States as well. So I'm looking at that.
It seems as if there's a growing concerted effort among many of the Western countries in the world now to really begin to take China on. Would that be fair to say?
I don't know whether taking China on is the right word, but they're trying to protect their interests, as China is protecting its own. And it isn't a level playing field, and China has been gaming the system. So it's time for some pushback. Everyone wants China to succeed. That's not the point. The point is that these countries have to look out for their own interests just as China looks out for its.
Just as we have to look out for ours, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a never-ending struggle.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thanks to my guests, Usha Haley and Ian Proudfoot. Be sure to check out the website for all of the latest news on Country 99 TV. By the way, you may have noticed the nights are getting cooler. Did you notice that? Getting a bit cooler there? Yeah? Take care of yourself. Keep warm. Keep the faith. See you next time.